Good afternoon and welcome to a timely panel discussion jointly organized by the Atlantic Council and ITIC. 30 years of US-Kazakhstan relations, the winter crisis and the path forward. We're delighted to welcome you participating virtually and also to our dear guests who are here together with us in person. As we witness with horror the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are reminded of the challenging geography Kazakhstan occupies, the importance of nuclear non-proliferation, and the role of energy security, and frankly, the value of a good, reliable friend in a tough neighborhood. That is Kazakhstan. ESG has become a commonly used acronym. At ITIC, we have a similar named program, EGS, Energy, Growth, and Security. And it is that program, led by Ariel Cohen, that is co-organizing today's event. For over 30 years, Kazakhstan has been a strong, reliable, and trusted U.S. partner. Kazakhstan's responsible and unwavering nuclear non-proliferation and their open trade and investment policies have contributed to stability and prosperity, albeit it has been tested at times like this past January. To further understand the deep and mutually beneficial special relationship, not only for our governments, but for many U.S. companies and our people, I urge you to read the report that was co-authored by Dr. Cohen and James Grant that examines our 30 years of bilateral ties in the special U.S.-Kazakhstan relationship. It was a difficult and dark period for Kazakhstan at the start of 2022. Once again, energy, prices, and supply chains started the peaceful political rallies. We'll hear more about their winter crisis and their current political and economic situation. But it's important to note, as we speak here today, there are no foreign troops on Kazakhstan soil. And to tell us more about Kazakhstan and these events, it's a great pleasure to introduce my friend, His Excellency Yerzhan Ashikbayev, Kazakhstan's ambassador to the United States of America. The ambassador arrived this past summer. He quickly became a well-respected diplomat in Washington. Prior to coming to Washington, he served, you won't know it by his youthful look, for almost 25 years in his country's foreign service. And his previous posts have included Deputy Head of the Prime Minister's Office and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ashikbayev. Please.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Dear friends, first and foremost, it's a great pleasure for me to join you all here. I want to thank Ambassador Herbst, you and your colleagues for hosting this event. And of course, great thanks to Dan, Witt, and ITIC. I'm also very much looking forward to a lively discussion to be moderated by Ms. Melinda Herring and our great panelists, Dr. Kamran Bokhari and Dr. Ariel Cohen. So today's discussion covers both solemn and tragic. Solemn part is that we will be celebrating 30 years of US-Kazakhstan relations. And what started as a relationship of the biggest superpower with completely unknown state actor, Kazakhstan, within 30 years developed into very trusted partnership, enhanced strategic partnership relations, as we call them. So then Mr. Witt had already referred to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation issues. Equally so could be said about denuclearization, disarmament in other spheres of weapons of mass destruction. This naturally goes also to the issues of insecurity domain, to the issues of countering terrorist threat, as Kazakhstan not only supported from the day one the actions by the United States and coalition forces in Afghanistan, but also been a trusted, a reliable partner in the global war against terrorism. And one of the latest achievements is the repatriation of over 700 individuals from formerly ISIL-controlled areas to Kazakhstan. Our country is a destination for over 55 billion of US investments and home to over 500 US companies. As a result, Caspian Pipeline Consortium has been providing now 1.2% of global oil supplies. Convening power of Kazakh diplomacy has been instrumental in bringing delicate and secure messages in the region, facilitating the mediation process. JCPOA talks is among those areas. Kazakhstan has also been the net contributor to peace and security in Central Asia and the driving force behind establishment and development of C5+1 dialogue platform. So now I believe I have characterize it fully, the at least part of our relationship, which brings us, both myself and Mr. Witt's conclusion that Kazakhstan is definitely a trusted and reliable partner of the United States. Now, the question with ongoing geopolitical shifts stipulated not only with the situation in Ukraine, but also with withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan, is what would be the substance of our partnership for the next 30 years. So let me briefly address the tragic part of today's topic. First, the January events in Kazakhstan, no one would ever predicted that to happen in Kazakhstan. So let's be clear on that. The government of Kazakhstan clearly differentiates between peaceful protesters and violent rioters. Secondly, we have no issues with peaceful protesters, and the government of Kazakhstan, from the very early stages of those January events, quickly engaged to address legitimate grievances and demands of the peaceful protesters. Thirdly, while protests were peaceful, the law enforcement officers acted with utmost restraint. Fourth, many experts agree that peaceful protests were hijacked by perpetrators and terrorist groups, triggering mass riots and looting. Fifth, the CSTO peacekeepers, they served as a backup, protecting critical infrastructure without any practical involvement in the ground operations, which were conducted by Kazakh law enforcement. And within less than 2 weeks, all 2,282 peacekeepers from 5 CSTO member nations, they are all gone. The government condemns in the strongest terms any possible cases of excessive use of force, unlawful detention, torture, and cruel treatment of detainees. Each complaint about abuse of power and excessive use of force is assessed by the law enforcement bodies. And all those responsible for violation of human rights will be held accountable in line with the law. So the government is actively engaging with civil society groups and NGOs. All in all, overall, the January events, the tragic January events, were a huge stress test for Kazakhstan. But most importantly, as a nation, as a government, Kazakhstan proved to be resilient enough to withstand such a pressure and bounce back. Now we turn a new page in Kazakhstan history. Currently, there are 3 major pillars we are focused on: addressing root causes, ensuring fair and impartial investigation, and building a new Kazakhstan. President Tokayev remains committed to economic modernization and political liberalization agenda. Next week, on March 16th, he will address the nation, unveiling preliminary results of the investigation and announcing a new package of political reforms. Let me make a couple of comments on Ukraine. As a nation, Kazakhstan is very much concerned with the ongoing military conflict in Ukraine and urge to facilitate a peaceful and diplomatic settlement. Let me reiterate that Kazakhstan is interested in Ukraine's stability, independence, and territorial integrity. And we've taken very clear position on that. Kazakhstan has a long proven track record of not recognizing new states, be it Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Kosovo, and equally so the issue of recognition of LNR, DNR, LPR, DPR are not in our agenda. I want to conclude my remarks by saying that despite relatively small population of 19 million, Kazakhstan is too important to be overlooked. So with this, I very much look forward to our today's discussion, and I remain 24/7 here in DC, open to any comments, any suggestions, and any offers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're going to take you up on your offer of openness and hope to have you here very often. Thank you so much. So I have the pleasure, I'm Melinda Herring, I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and this feels very weird because we have guests in-house today. And it's wonderful to have you guys back and not being wearing masks. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Get them ready, and be sure to put a hand up when we have Q&A. The staff will come by. So I am lucky to moderate this panel today with Ambassador John Herbst, who is the Senior Director of the Eurasia Center and a former ambassador to Uzbekistan, Dr. Ariel Cohen, one of my favorite senior fellows, and he also belongs to Dan Witt some of the time. He's also with ITIC. And then finally, a new friend, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, who's the Director of Analytical Development at Newlines Institute. And it's great to have you guys here. Let's jump right in. I liked a lot of the comments that Mr. Ambassador just put forth. He said that we're going to be examining root causes of what happened in January. We're going to be putting together an investigation, and then we're going to be talking about building a new Kazakhstan. Ariel, can you tell me a little bit more about what you expect to be rolled out next week, if we know anything at all? The ambassador just said that there's going to be a package of economic reforms that'll be rolled out. What can we expect next week, Ariel?
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that what's going on in Ukraine is going to affect every country in the former Soviet Union and many countries beyond. We already see, President of Finland jetting to see Biden because Russia is threatening them. Yeah. And they were in the Russian Empire, 110 years ago. So all bets are off. Mm-hmm. We are in a whole new security and economic environment. And with God's help, we will not get into nuclear escalation. That's my big concern is. And Kazakhstan actually was a model of how to do it in terms of nuclear disarmament back in 1991 when President Nazarbayev gave up the nuclear weapons that were the legacy weapons of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Ukraine did the same, and now Ukraine probably is reconsidering what they've done. Back to your question. The Kazakhs understood that something was off with the economy and with the distribution of wealth. Kazakhstan, in terms of natural resources, is a rich country. In terms of income, it's upper middle income country. In upper middle income countries, the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, is often high. So we're talking about a country where $500 and more was an average salary, but minimal salaries were in $100 a month range. This needs to be addressed, and I think President Tokayev understands that. And what I hear coming from the president in terms of the guidance to the government, because you cannot, just one person cannot push the button and rearrange income distribution in a big country. So what the government is going to do is to address the cash flows of the companies. President Tokayev said that we had a small group of people that got a lot of money, the Forbes list billionaires, and that needs to be addressed. The taxation needs to be addressed. The entrepreneurship and small businesses also need to be encouraged. The best model is for the economy to create their jobs in medium and small sized businesses. There are issues of healthcare, there are issues of education, the issues of corruption. I very much expect a lot of this being addressed. If you remember, after the January horrible events, President Tokayev said, I'm going to create a big economic reform program for September, political reform and economic reform. Now I think he's pushing some of these priorities faster. So we'll get it in a week. And these are very challenging times because those companies that were looking to invest in Kazakhstan are concerned not because of Kazakhstan, they're concerned because of Russia and Ukraine.
Sure.
So the political risk went up, not because of Kazakhstan, but because of Russia and Ukraine. And I'll just finish with one thing, what the ambassador said. This was a very serious stress test. In fact, it was the second stress test. The first one was COVID.
With COVID?
Yeah.
Okay.
COVID was a stress test all over the world. For this country, I have things to say about our country, but it's not on this event.
That'll be over wine tonight. No, let's stick with Kazakhstan.
I published about that 3 articles. With Kazakhstan, I hope that they passed both the COVID test as stress test and the January events stress test, as long as the economic, corruption, education, healthcare, income distribution, all these issues will be addressed and people understand that the government is serious. I would add one more thing. President Tokayev talks about more open society. This is very important from a cynical perspective to get the steam out when people are really angry that instead of what we saw happen, that criminal elements and others went and broke windows and stole weapons. People have avenues and channels to express their frustration, to petition, in good American tradition, petition their government, and the government is more responsive and there's more freedom of expression and political participation in Kazakhstan.
Thanks a lot, Ariel. I'd like to ask my team if you can go ahead and put Ariel's report down in the chat for those who are watching online. Ariel's just written a great new report. It's very dense. It'll take you at least an hour to read. Has lots of good footnotes.
Don't call me dense.
No, not at all. Ambassador Herbst, the ambassador said something very interesting. He said that the January protests were surprising and no one predicted them. Now, I'm not going to arm wrestle with the ambassador, but I saw some information that suggests that there's been growing protests from 2019 on. So if you measure the discontent in society, it had been growing in 2019, 2020, 2021. Were you surprised by the protests in January?
I would tend to agree with the ambassador. I think that people who follow the region, people who look at Kazakhstan, were in fact surprised by this. And I would differentiate between what happened this January and the protests that we saw before. The protests we saw before clearly had a spontaneous, a bottom-up dimension. And I'm not saying that January was without that, but it gathered serious force because there were other factors at play, which meant that instead of the police being able to manage these demonstrations, they were not manageable. So buildings were open, airports were open, and damage could be done. So that's what made this very different. But I would just like to add one thing. I've been doing events here for 8 years, hundreds of events, and never until today did anyone bring up the Gini coefficient. So congratulations. I remember that from economics and undergraduate.
Well, we're talking about income inequality. I think it's important to say, Ariel, if I can come back to you, then I'm going to bring you in a minute, Kamran. Explain about the income inequality in Western Kazakhstan, if you don't mind, Ariel, just in a couple of sentences.
Well, in general, in Kazakhstan, the oil industry, which is a big cash earner in Kazakhstan, has workers, and these workers understand they're sitting on a vital resource. So they are willing to go and protest in Western Kazakhstan. And also the tradition of that Jews, of that tribal alliance, is to be very open and outspoken. I don't think that in the end of the day, those guys were the big problem. I think it was the impoverished people who moved to big cities, who didn't have $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month jobs in the oil industry. Yeah, they protested because they understand it's kind of like having a trade union, squeezing some vital resource. They protested, and sometimes the reaction was above and beyond the necessary. But impoverished people who couldn't put bread on the table, who felt that they have nothing to lose, that is something, that is the kind of kindle that kindles the fire, the societal fire, in a place like Kazakhstan or in many other places around the world.
For sure.
So it's not the $500 a month, $1,000 a month people, it's $100 a month people that felt they have nothing to lose. They went and they rampaged and they beat people up and they stole weapons and whatnot.
Okay, super. Kamran, you just wrote an interesting piece, and you wrote that the crisis in Kazakhstan isn't as big of a deal as many people believe. Why not?
Well, I mean, in the sense that if you look at Kazakhstan, and we had a nearly two-week uprising, that didn't append the trajectory that Kazakhstan has been on for the past 30 years, and of developing as a post-Soviet state. And then it's only been 3 years since we've seen actually a political transition. Number two is that we need to be able to factor in, when I say we, I mean observers, analysts, just the general public, that it's not going to be smooth sailing. When you're in transition, when you're reforming from, what used to be a Soviet socialist republic to a modern developed political economy with all its challenges and heavily reliant on, oil as a revenue generator, then obviously these things have to be factored in. And I was actually speaking sort of to the reaction that we got, that people began to sort of compare this to Syria and Yemen and Libya, as if this is the Arab Spring had probably traveled to Central Asia. And I sort of said, look, I mean, let's just take one indicator. There was a huge deal about Russia sending in a CSTO task force. Somewhere around 3,500 or more or less troops. They were in and out in 5 days. So the point is that what happened over a period of less than 2 weeks, what happened after that? And the other thing is that we in the West, and I mean, we are justified in sort of wanting to see democracy take root, and political reforms in all parts of the world. But we forget that every nation has its own trajectory. It's not going to look like, there isn't sort of a cookie cutter way of moving forward on this. And there are starting points matter. Where did Kazakhstan start? And I think that this is by no means an uprising in the sense that it has led to some sort of a failure of the system. The system needs to be pushed forward. And I think that things like this help policymakers, and in this case, the government of President Tokayev, to navigate. I mean, sometimes you are slow in your political reforms, and these kind of events then help the government to sort of say, okay, there are reality checks, that it's not enough, you need to open up more, you need to put a bit more effort in. And it's a messy process. I mean, it's to consider it as some sort of like, the sky is falling, is what I was sort of arguing against.
Okay, got it. So let me ask you, that what you said was really interesting. I didn't see that on Twitter, that people were comparing it to Syria and other places. Do you think it's because so few people know anything about Kazakhstan? Is that why they were making these sort of dumb historical comparisons?
Yes, and it's also we live in a social media age where you go by the regions that you know. Okay. And then the number of voices speaking on this So you can easily see those who became, who were known as experts of one area, then all of a sudden are searching for relevance and sort of saying, okay, what can I say about this area that I really don't know anything about?
Gotcha. I have a question for you. Okay, let's talk about Tokayev. So Kamran has just said that it didn't change the trajectory. What happened in January didn't change the trajectory of Kazakhstan. Of development, yeah. But one of the things that people were very concerned about was that Tokayev had to call in the CSTO, right? And people were really upset that seemed to say that Kazakhstan was giving up part of its sovereignty. What's your response to that concern?
My response is that if you have 2,500 people coming in for 5 days,
In and out 5 days.
in and out 5 days with landing, unpacking, and packing, so net was 3.5 days. That's not. It could be worse.
Yeah.
Right. I wrote a book called Russian Imperialism. There are many cases where Russians didn't pack and leave after 3 days. So I personally expected for them to stay there. But I wanted to, when you get into the comparison business, a very prominent scholar of post-Soviet space and economic development actually compared that unrest with unrest in Asian countries, which I think is more relevant than the Middle Eastern countries.
Which country is most relevant, Ariel?
He said South Korea,
Okay.
Indonesia, and I forgot there was one more. So when you move from an authoritarian model and you are in sort of upper middle income development, the vector is actually towards more openness and more democracy, and the society is sort of shaking the structure.
Yeah.
The challenge in Kazakhstan is a location. It's you're near China and Russia that are increasingly authoritarian. I'm calling what's happening in Russia now the totalitarian turn. When you shut down Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, shut down Echo Moskvy, shut down everything. That's not a light authoritarianism that Putin pursued for 20 plus years. This is totalitarian.
Yep, it's a different Putin than he was at the end of '99. John, I have an obvious question for you. So Tokayev had to call in the CSTO. Is he weaker or stronger now? How would you assess him?
Well, certainly having to rely on a foreign power or powers plural to restore order is a sign of weakness. The question is, how quickly does he rebound? The fact underscored already that Russian troops and other CSTO troops were there for just a few days is a good sign. But I think it's safe to say that he's perhaps a bit more beholden to Moscow than he was 7 or 8 months ago. But we already see the limits of that dependence, or that sort of independence. I don't want to say dependence straight, because Kazakh troops are not heading into Ukraine. So that's a clear indicator that there are limits to Moscow's new influence, and that's a good thing.
For sure. Kamran, you had a...
Yeah, I just wanted to add that to what Ariel was saying about in and out, and how long they were on the ground. It is very clear that the heavy lifting was done by Kazakh security forces.
Okay.
The reports that we have of these the CSTO task force was they were guarding facilities, but the actual stabilization efforts, the operations, were done by Kazakh security forces. And I would also add that I would look at it from Putin's point of view. You're already focused on Ukraine, and then you have this thing on your strategic rear, and you're already worried about colored revolutions coming from the West, and you're thinking, what's happening in my backyard. So I wouldn't say this, allowed Putin to flex muscle. I think there's a good element of, oh my God, I want to do this, but I have to do this.
Distraction.
It's a distraction,
Right.
and I think he breathed a sigh of relief that I don't really need to be there. I can go back to Ukraine.
Yep.
Yeah,
Ariel,
just can I add one little thing?
Ariel, I'm the moderator, okay?
Yeah, but
Come
I'm
on.
asking, can I?
No,
can I-
I'm going to ask you about, if you can add it as soon as I ask you this question.
Okay,
Okay.
all right.
So I want to talk to you about foreign direct investment, because you know a lot about this. And you said that there was a problem because there were 2 stress tests There was COVID, and then there was what happened in January. So Kazakhstan has done a really good job compared to the rest of the Central Asian countries in projecting an image of stability and prosperity. And that image may have changed some because of January. Can Kazakhstan still attract investment from the West? And if so, how can it do that?
Right. So what I wanted to say, apropos what Kamran said, that there are reports that one of the reasons that Russia pulled out so quickly is when the comrades in Beijing called and said, would you like us to come and add to the security operation? Or if you don't, get the bleep out of there. And they got out of there. So I think we need to, when we look at Kazakhstan today, we can't only look at Moscow, we need to look at Moscow and Beijing. Yeah. That's very interesting. As to your question, look, did you see the Brent oil price today?
Yeah.
It's like 115, 120, something like that. And Kazakhstan, in addition to oil, has natural gas, uranium. In December, the EU declared that now nuclear power is going to be a green power, which, you're right, it is. It's zero emissions. Where the uranium is going to come from? Kazakhstan. The world cannot ignore Kazakhstan, but I would argue that these two stress tests are less relevant today. The COVID and the unrest in January. They're less relevant than what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. Because what's going on between Russia and Ukraine is a big, huge security event. It's not a black swan because I was predicting it for 3 years, and others people did too, but it will change the security dynamic in all of Eurasia and in Europe. And we need to be careful. I think investors usually are cowards. They will sit there and watch till the dust settles. But when the dust settles, they'll be back in Kazakhstan.
Okay.
Do you agree?
Yeah. Kamran, I have a question for you. So the ambassadors talked about some of the reforms that are underway now, and Tokayev has put some meaningful reforms into place. What else can we expect? Do we expect Tokayev to start cracking down on corruption? What other reforms do you anticipate this year?
So I am definitely expecting that because there are two elements to this. One is that how do you sort of address the concerns of the population? It's harder to sort of open up for freedoms, that as we've seen in multiple cases around the world, but a very quick win, or at least to get the population to reorient itself to the system and have trust in it, is to say, look, we're going to go after the corrupt people. And I think that this is something that President Tokayev has openly said in the very early days. During the unrest, he named, or hinted that, people who were privileged politically before, their allies have benefited from this system. So it only makes sense for President Tokayev to come out and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And going after corruption is like, a quick win, if you will. It's like the low-hanging fruit, and you want to be able to, before you can get to other more complex reforms, like how do you open up space for people to express themselves? How do you open up the electoral process? Those are much harder, and they require time. And I think what this unrest has done is actually accelerate. This is what I argued in my piece in Newsweek, is this unrest has accelerated the reforms that President Tokayev was already undertaking since he came to power 3 years ago. And I think that it will help him move forward, because there's a demand now. It's like a pull and push factor. You're pushing reforms, but then the population is pulling harder. So how do you bring that equilibrium? And I think that's where this government is right now.
Super, thank you. Ambassador Herbst, we've been dancing around Russia and Ukraine for 20 minutes. What effect is Central Asia likely to feel as a result of the Russian sanctions?
Well, the Russia sanctions are targeted to Russia. There's a recognition that other countries may be affected by this. And I'm not talking now about, for example, the Western partners of Russia, but those especially in the Eurasian Economic Union, of whom Kazakhstan is the most important member economically after Russia. I know when we did sanctions back in 14 and 15, the Kazakhstan factor was taken into consideration. I believe it's taken into consideration now as well. However, the sanctions are so powerful, there will certainly be some impact in Kazakhstan, some negative impact.
Yeah. Do you have any more insight on that?
Yes.
Since the economies are
Yes.
so intertwined.
The number one concern of the White House after the arms to Ukraine, what arms to Ukraine, etc., is what's going to happen in the global oil economy. And Kazakhstan is an important player. I understand, I did not have time to sort of dig deeply, but I understand that even the Rosneft, the Russian state-owned oil company directed by Igor Sechin, the Putin buddy, even they are not under sanctions yet. Why on earth would you sanction a U.S. partner in Central Asia that also pumps, 1.5 million barrels a day? It'll be shooting ourselves in the foot. The other thing is, there's a pipeline that Russia has equity in. It's Eastern Caspian Consortium, CPC. We have to be careful. We don't need oil to go from 115 to 135. And every barrel matters here because it's the marginal cost of oil that, marginal cost of oil is affected by marginal suppliers. So I would not recommend sanctions against Azerbaijan, against Kazakhstan. Who else is there? Gas, Turkmen. Well, I wish we get Turkmen gas to Europe. We're talking about it for 30 years, and the Turkmens still didn't get off their can and build that little connector, 120 kilometers to get gas to Europe. But Kazakhstan articulated very clearly, they are a neutral power here, they have good relations with Ukraine, they want to help, they want to mediate. Kazakhstan did a lot of mediations in the past. We should not punish Kazakhstan for something they didn't commit.
Yeah, I just wanted to build up on what Ariel was saying. I think that we're looking at probably the most geopolitically significant event since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yep. And what this is going to do to a country like Kazakhstan is they're constantly reevaluating because this is a moving target. Yep. Who knows what's going to be the outcome of this conflict, how weak or strong Russia will be. What does that mean for energy? I think countries like Germany have been forced to pause and say, do we really want to be dependent? Because it's kind of like this, if it's not broken, let's not fix it, okay? So the 30 years since 1991 created a calm, a new normal, and I think that's been disrupted. So Nord Stream isn't as sort of reliable from Berlin's point of view as it used to be. How can you go back to doing business, the way it was?
It's dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's dead.
Is my favorite
Yoke.
word.
Yeah, I mean, so you can't go back. So I think this is where Turkmen and even Azeri gas is going to become very, very important. I think that I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'm willing to say that Russia's ability to sort of monopolize the flow of energy through its territory has probably taken a hit. The question is how serious, because when you don't come up with alternatives because things are going well and you're not used to looking into the future of the crystal ball, things like this force you to. And I think that by the time we get to a new normal, the dependency, you're going to have to find ways to work around the dependency on Russia. And the same goes for Turkey, which is now roughly 40 to 50% of its natural gas consumption comes from Russia. So everybody's looking at this and saying, okay, what do we need to adjust? And I think the adjustment will be, of course, diplomatic and security-wise, but mainly energy.
Okay, there's one prediction. Got it. Ambassador Herbst, so many of us are very, very focused. You're very focused, laser focused on Russia's full scale of invasion now. And I'm going to ask you to put on your Old Testament prophet hat. What does Putin's war in Ukraine, how does it affect U.S. policy towards Kazakhstan and Central Asia? And it's okay to say it's still in formation, but any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure that the U.S. government reacts fast enough to begin truly thinking about this. There is limited attention span. Having said that, I believe that within Central Asia itself, it strengthens the caution we've already seen about not going too far away from Moscow to prevent a Russian crackdown. I think Kazakhstan, which shares a long border with Russia, and which was subject to some very, very undiplomatic remarks from Putin back at Lake Seliger in the summer of 2014, has done a pretty good job of managing this. I mean, of course, I served in Uzbekistan, which had the great luxury of being distant from Russia, separated by Kazakhstan, and actually, I guess, Turkmenistan, which enabled them to have a little bit more independence vis-a-vis Moscow. As for our own policy, if we are smart, and that's an if, we would be strengthening our relations in all ways acceptable to our long-term partners in Central Asia, of whom, of course, our most important ones are in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. I've been advocating that for years, actually, but it's even more important now. And this follows up on a point that I think Ariel made, that Moscow was partly checked when it went into Kazakhstan, when it led the CSTO into Kazakhstan in January because of China. And back in the days before China took off its mask and showed its teeth to the United States, I always thought that China would be a check on Russia and especially Kazakhstan, more so than we would be. And that insight, I think, remains true, and perhaps more so now because it's very clear in the relations between Beijing and Moscow. Beijing is a senior partner. And as a result of the serious problems that Putin is experiencing in Ukraine, that seniority is greater today.
John, let me follow up. How do we become, are we junior partners now?
In Central Asia?
Yeah.
Well, we were never senior partners, though you could make a case that right after 9/11,
Even before that.
well, Ariel's disagreeing with me, well, yeah, of course, that's great.
Well, I don't
but first I'm going to make my point, then I'll come back to your counterpoint. After 9/11, when we wound up putting bases, first in Uzbekistan and then Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, that greatly increased our influence in the region. But we were always careful about what we were doing. It was focused on Afghanistan. We tried to develop a better relationship, but we knew we were swimming partly against the tide. Now, having come back to Ariel's point that we were important partners back in the 90s, and of course that's true. The Uzbeks reached out to us right away. The Kazakhs, we had the deal of the century and the development of Kazakhstan hydrocarbons with U.S. firms, which was clear proof of Nazarbayev's understanding that while he had to, in certain ways, bow to Moscow, he could not let Moscow dictate critical concerns for Kazakhstan. So that was a really smart and necessary move. But even then, Ariel, I agree, our role was critical for developing Kazakhstan's economy, but we never had quite the oomph at that point in Almaty and Astana that the Russians had.
Okay, guys, my last question for you, and then we're going to bring in the audience. Thank you guys for being patient. So if we're reimagining a new strategy towards Central Asia, a U.S. strategy towards Central Asia, I want you to give me one concrete policy initiative that you think that would be important that you would ask the State Department to prioritize.
Shall I start?
Please.
So I've been arguing this in my recent pieces. I wrote a piece about a year ago in the Wall Street Journal saying that Central Asia is a big hole in the Biden administration's thinking about foreign policy, national security. Kazakhstan, you can't have a policy on Central Asia without engaging Kazakhstan. Now more than ever, for two reasons. Number one, the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Okay, that can affect Central Asia, and you need Kazakhstan to be in there. Number two is what's going on right now in Ukraine and its effects on Russia. And I think that now more than ever before, the United States needs to enhance. And number three is the winter crisis. Look, Russia may send 3,500 troops to 2,500 troops for 5 days, 3 days, whatever it was, to help stabilize the situation, and even that was, exaggerated. But Russia cannot help Kazakhstan develop politically, economically, socially. The United States is the partner for that. I think now is the opportunity to to up our game, so where we are helping them with political economic reform, engaging in areas that we need to, whether it's investment, helping with develop parliamentary life and whatnot. Because if we don't do it right now, we will miss a big window of opportunity created by the crisis in Ukraine and Afghanistan.
So, Kamran, you feel like there's a real sense of openness right now to push some of those harder reforms?
Absolutely. I think that the reforms have to come from Kazakhstan, but we need to be able to help them in this turbulent age where Russia is spinning, somewhere, and then the Chinese are there as well, trying to fill in the vacuum. And then Afghanistan is radiating instability. The Turks have their agenda as well for this region. The Iranians have that. This is the time for the United States to go in and engage far more effectively, strongly with Kazakhstan. And that would lead to regional stability, or at least give us a mechanism with which to manage this region. If we don't do it, then we have nobody to blame but ourselves.
Agreed. Ariel?
In 2005, I edited and published a book called Eurasia in Balance. It was Ashgate, UK. And in the preface I said, Central Asia may be a bridge too far. And remember, this is the peak of engagement in Afghanistan. Maybe a bridge too far for the United States. I think the following years showed that we really don't manage to wrap our brains around Central Asia, despite the fact that if you go to a good school, like I went to Fletcher School, they teach you there that Admiral Mahan, 120 years ago, said that Central Asia is the heart of Eurasia, and he who controls Eurasia controls the eastern, the world island.
Actually, that was his twin, Mackinder.
Mackinder, yeah.
And Mahan was the counterpart.
Right. Mackinder said that. It is hard to find outside of this room, I have four ambassadors here, a lot of people in Washington who read Mackinder and understand the logic and can look at the maps. That brings me to my hobby horse, that what we're talking about here mostly is power, energy, and geography. Yeah. And power is not politically correct, oil is not green, and geography they don't teach in American schools. So guys, ladies, let's wake up. Because when you look at it through these lenses, you understand how Kazakhstan is important, how Central Asia is important, how Eurasia is important.
So what are you going to put in the policy, Ariel?
I will put the policy of all of engagement, not being a militaristic power there. China and Russia, of course, can check us on the hard power, but there's so much more that we can do in econ, in business and investment, in education and healthcare, and all these other things. And having traveled in the region, having engaged with a lot of people in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and elsewhere, I know these people are not really looking at Moscow and Beijing as the model of their future. They look all over, they understand there's a big world out there, and we can provide a lot. But understanding what is at stake, if we think, this is not important, then of course nothing will happen. And sometimes when I hear policymakers talk, the message I get is that, it's maybe not so important, and it's wrong.
What would you go in your policy?
I agree with my colleagues. I would simply say this. We keep talking about we being in a world of great power competition, which we are. Then we should understand that Central Asia borders our two rivals. And we should greatly strengthen everything that Ariel said, meaning, the soft power, business, culture, and all those things. But I would add, we should not neglect security. And what I mean by that is, we're not going to put a base there, we're not going to put a base there. But we know that the Central Asian governments are looking for enhanced, for example, support on border security. And I know we're doing some of that. We should do more. And we should prioritize the region in our foreign policy in the form of senior officials, secretaries of state and defense, deputy secretaries of state and defense should be out there at least once a year, maybe twice a year, and bring these folks to Washington. This is absolutely critical. And one more point. I suspect that Putin's great misadventure in Ukraine is going to lead to serious changes in Russian policy. Probably positive changes along the line that Dmitry Trenin foreshadowed in a book he wrote 20 years ago and then had to back away from, where Russia stops being an imperial power and becomes a kind of normal nation.
Well,
At that moment,
good luck with that.
if that happens, we would be natural partners with Russia vis-a-vis China, but also in Central Asia. And Russia would welcome our support as they are a security force in Central Asia.
Wonderful. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome your questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and put your hand up. I'm going to turn to my Zoom questions, but you guys are up next. Here come our iPads. Okay, the first question. This one is for Ariel. Can you speak to Nazarbayevs Legacy? Has it changed since January?
Well, depends who is narrating that legacy. President Nazarbayev was a founding president of the most successful country in Central Asia. He was a leader, or is a leader, in non-proliferation. He gave a huge push to Kazakhstan's, to Kazakh language and Kazakhstan's culture. Don't forget, there was a purposeful process of eradication of the language up to and including that the majority of people in Kazakhstan would prefer speaking Russian and not Kazakh. But at the same time, as the current administration pointed out, on his watch, some people became very rich and they didn't share, and now they have to share. That is back to our earlier discussion of income redistribution and the Gini coefficient.
Ambassador.
But overall, I think the Kazakh people and the Kazakh leadership will think about President Nazarbayev's role and give their assessment of it. We, the outsiders, are not here to say, good, bad, indifferent, and give out grades and marks. He is part and parcel of that people, and that people will evaluate him.
Well, I think we're analysts and we can evaluate. I'm a Ukraine analyst and I evaluate all the time. What do you say about Nazarbayev's legacy?
I think Ariel pretty much nailed it. He deserves great credit for setting the country's economy on a free market, largely a Western-oriented course, despite the severe pressures on him not to do so. And that is the major fact.
Okay, great. Ambassador Herbst, is it possible that Kazakhstan could act as a neutral venue for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, it could, and there are probably 15 or 20 other contestants for that role. There'll only be real talks to end the war when Putin decides that his great adventure in Ukraine has crashed. But I don't think he's recognized that yet, and maybe he's psychologically unable to. I hope not.
Kamran, does Kazakhstan have a preference where it gets its FDI? Do they care US versus China versus Russia?
Look, I mean, this country basically wrote the book on multi-vector foreign policy.
True.
So, and then in geopolitics, we say what you want and what you can have are two different things. I think that, the Kazakh government would like more engagement or more FDI from the West. It also is a factor of who can invest. Russia, isn't in a position to invest. The Chinese model of investing isn't exactly what we would call FDI in sort of in the way we do it. So I think the choice is made for the Kazakhs, but I think that they will continue to push on multi-vector foreign policy, and I will be interested to watch how this multi-vector foreign policy perspective or outlook or modus operandi evolves with the changes in Russia that I agree with Ambassador Herbst is going to change, because I don't think that Russia is going to come out powerful from what it did.
Yeah, I think we're going to have this discussion in a couple of months, right? A lot of this is TBD. Can I get a thumbs up from the staff? Have we posted Dr. Ariel Cohen's report? Yes, terrific. Okay, someone had asked for that. Thank you. Okay, Ariel, tell us a little bit about, we were having a discussion about the sanctions on Russia and that they'll have a negative effect on the Kazakh economy. Is there anything the U.S. can do to ensure that there is limited collateral damage from these sanctions?
First of all, we need to be aware, unfortunately, people who sort of rushing forward and say, oh, let's slap these sanctions, let's slap those sanctions on Russia. One, what we're talking about, collateral damage, but also with Russia. Putin said that the sanctions so far were close to declaration of war, but thank God, said Putin, we're not. I remember, I'm thinking about FDR, Roosevelt, imposing an embargo on gasoline supply to Japan that triggered the attack on Pearl Harbor and got the US into World War II. I don't want the US and Russia to go into a full-scale nuclear exchange. Back to collateral damage in Kazakhstan, I think for reasons that escape me entirely, and everybody I asked couldn't explain to me, Kazakhstan is still under Jackson Vanik? Why? Jackson Vanik, for those young people here, is a 1974 legislation to allow the Soviet Jews, like myself, to leave Mother Russia, to leave the Soviet Union. We did, in great numbers. Why keep it here? Why keep this legislation? I talked to some congressional staffers and said, well, what can we get, if we raise it? They said, go negotiate with the Kazakhs or with the Uzbeks or whoever it is. What can you get for it? But stop, doing this. This is offensive and it's not achieving any purpose. So lift Jackson Vanik and pay attention to the sanctions that may affect our interests, like getting Kazakh oil into the global market.
Okay, great. Kamran, a question for you about internet freedom. Are there any planned reforms to expand internet freedom in Kazakhstan, or will the state controls be expanded following the January crisis?
I think that by all accounts, it seems like the idea of control is not one. I don't think that the government in Kazakhstan is going to take that route. Now, how quickly you expand internet freedom and how quickly you allow for more social space electronically and otherwise, that's a different question, and I think we'll just have to wait and see. But I seriously doubt that the lesson that was learned from the January unrest is that you need to crack down more harder. I think it's the exact opposite. The question is, how will they do it? What will be the pace of opening up the system, whether it's cyberspace or the physical public space? But I seriously doubt that you would want to do something that actually will make people resent you more than like you. And with the talk of reform, I seriously doubt that will happen.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. John, similar theme. What, if any, are the human rights challenges Kazakhstan continues to address?
Well, I think that this has partly been addressed already. They need to open up the economic prosperity for others, deal with the problem of inequality. And I think that there is a history of overuse of security forces when people are seen to break with those at the top of the regime. That needs to cease. And there needs to be more freedom in the media.
How about democratic elections, too?
I spent a lot of time in Central Asia, and while I agree that democratic elections are to be are something we should seek, I think the things I just mentioned are a little bit easy to achieve, and if we achieve them, that would set the stage for the next step, which would be truly democratic elections.
I'm still waiting for democratic elections. I was an election observer in Kazakhstan about 10 years ago.
I think implicit in my remarks was the fact that we haven't really seen them.
Yep, that's right. Okay. Ariel, you mentioned that the true source of unrest in Kazakhstan is in the cities with poor migrants. What realistic steps can the Kazakh government take to improve urban grievances, and how might the U.S. support these efforts?
Well, we're talking essentially about income redistribution, poverty eradication, fighting corruption, providing services. This is heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And I talked to some Kazakh officials, leaders, observers. It's hard. It's hard work, as George W. Bush said about his job. You can do demonstration projects. You can show that this is on the agenda, but you need to allocate some real resources. The real resources should not go to rich oligarchs. They should go to targeted, if it's subsidies, it's not subsidies for everybody. It's targeted subsidies for the poorest elements, housing projects, better schools, pathways for the future. For people know, we may not get it, but our kids will get it. The upward mobility, education, scholarships, things like that. But I can also say from my experiences traveling there and expectations, listening to the expectations of people, these people want better life for themselves and for their kids. They want to put bread on the table, get education for the kids, having health care, being, if they're rich enough, able to travel to Turkey, spend 2 weeks on the beach. And that is achievable, but it's tough. There's something called the middle income country trap. And that is that, you could get from $2,000 a year average income to $10,000, like Kazakhstan did, to $10,000 a year. But in order to get to 30, you need to attract high-tech investment, not just oil and gas. There'll be a lot of demand for oil in the foreseeable future, uranium, all the metals that go to batteries and robots and whatever. So this precious metals, we're doing some work in that space, James Grant and I. Precious metals are there in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan will do well developing it. But real high-tech, biotech, and all these high added value industries, that's a lot of heavy lifting too.
Kamran, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, look, the United States has a role to play in terms of sharing best practices. When you talk about reform, whether it's political reform, economic reform, there is that role. But I think that a lot of times, and this has happened in many countries where we try to help, a country to, move along on the democracy or political reform path, is that we run into obstacles because we're trying to push too hard while that country isn't ready. So I think there has to be a balance between us increasing capacity, doing capacity building, and leaving room for the fact that the best practices have to be operationalized in this case, in the Kazakh context.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and you've already said that there's demand, right? You've said that 2 or 3 times that there's real demand in Kazakhstan now. So, getting the balance right and tweaking it so the assistance isn't too aggressive. I got you. Go ahead, Ariel.
I also would like to point out that our values, and I'm an American, I respect American values, whatever they are, but they're not necessarily values in a country that was forcibly secularized and now sort of tentatively looking for its Islamic roots, and the gender roles are not the same as here, and we come very aggressively with our politically correct agendas and start pushing it. And we give ammunition to our opponents, including the Russians and the Chinese, saying, oh, look what the Americans are doing. They want to destroy your society with social values that are not traditional and unacceptable. We have to be a little bit more gentle and more sophisticated about that.
I'm with you, but we believe in universal values in America and at the Atlantic Council. And we should advance those universal values everywhere. I think we can quibble about what would go on that list. I think that's a discussion over wine tonight. Next question, guys.
We'll need a lot of wine.
Okay, good. The Kazakhstan government has made some moves towards green energy investment. Do we have any updates on those initiatives? Is Kazakhstan serious about renewables? Go ahead.
First of all, in the south, there's a lot of sun. And in the prairie, in the steppe, there's a lot of wind. That's a good news. The not so good news is somebody needs to invest in that. And countries in the region attracted multiple millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in very ambitious solar investment and some wind investment. I would suggest that, and we can talk, I can talk policy in renewables forever. We'll need a lot of wine for that. But Kazakhstan should pursue it, and it does pursue it, maybe not as aggressively, not as fast, but there's that, and they also need to make a decision about that nuclear reactor, where they're going to go with it, and if so, where it's going to come from, where the technology is going to come from. Before Ukraine, I would say 99.9% is going to be a Russian reactor. Today, I'm probably less sure about that. But having all that uranium, why not have a nuclear reactor there? Renewables are the future. We're just not in that future yet.
Great. Anything to add?
Nope.
Nope.
I'm
Cool.
good.
Great. Okay. So, John, you get the fun one. Ready? Kleptocracy is the new hot issue in D.C. How might this affect oligarchs in Kazakhstan who store their assets in the West?
Well, I think it's safe to say that this is not a fun season for oligarchs, wherever they may be. The clear focus on Russian oligarchs has made their lives very uncomfortable, and it will make it even more uncomfortable. I think it's not just going to be Russian oligarchs who ultimately be looked at. I think if serious measures are taken, for example, about money laundering into the United States and Britain, and the odds of that happening are going up, all extremely wealthy people from overseas whose money comes from not always respectable origins are going to face some headwinds. How precisely that plays out, I'm not certain, but it's coming.
Great. Ariel, Kazakhstan is often called the crown jewel of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Is that still the case, and how close are Kazakhstan and China really?
I think the expression I've seen is the buckle in the belt, not the crown jewel. I mean, crown jewel, suppose it's Chinese crown jewel. It's not Chinese crown jewel, but it's a buckle in the belt. It's a very strategic. It's very centrally located. I think that on an elite level, Chinese investment is, of course, welcome. On the popular level, we've seen some vocal protests. For example, there was a rumor, I think that the legislation didn't even pass. There was a rumor that Chinese will be allowed to buy land or even lease land for longer periods of time. There was a popular outcry in Kazakhstan about that. And they folded. They didn't do it. And this goes to something that is, again, I did my rant about geography. We don't study geography. We don't study history very well. And to understand the Chinese-Kazakh dynamic, you need to understand history going back 500 years, and a lot of Kazakhs have a very cautious attitude toward the Chinese comrades. I think China views Kazakhstan as a piece of territory, as a place on the map. The Kazakhs look at the Chinese as a huge country with, in many places, very high density of the population, whereas Kazakhstan has one of the lowest density of population around the globe. So guess what? The Kazakhs don't want all these Chinese to pour into Kazakhstan and colonize it. So I think there's some caution there when it comes to China.
I'd like to add to that I think that what needs to be kept in mind is the Chinese built the BRI because the United States was underwriting security in Afghanistan. Now that
Russia was underwriting security in
Central Asia. So now that both of them are in question, Afghanistan is on its own, frequency and wavelength. Yep. Nobody knows what's going to happen. This is not the kind of comfort zone that the Chinese are used to. Mm-hmm. They basically say, the whole Kazakh uprising. When everything was said and done, then the Chinese said, "Can we help you?" So
48 hours later.
48 hours later. So and look at how their reaction is. I mean, there's all sorts of talk about how now Russia and China can align to counter the U.S. Well, guess what? The Chinese are not happy with the invasion of Ukraine. It's making them really, really uncomfortable because it's bad for business, bad for BRI. So between Afghanistan, between what's happening to Russia, I think the Chinese ambitions on the BRI are going to be tempered.
Interesting. Okay, last question for you guys. Can Central Asia attract more investment if the initiatives were cross-border? For example, could there be a Kazakhstan-Uzbekistan investment project that helps spur more investment in the broader region?
Yes.
Okay. Ariel, let me pull a little bit more. How good are the courts in Kazakhstan? Are investors confident in their investment?
Good question. I'm glad you asked it. So there's something called Astana International Financial Center in Astana. It's located in this futuristic park that was the Expo of 2017 Expo. And Kazakhstan created almost like not a no-fly zone, that's in my subconscious.
Wrong country.
Yeah. It created a zone of application of the British law, of English law. And it imported a bunch of English jurists, up to and including the former Chief Lord Justice, Lord Wolfe of Britain, was the chairman of that court in the Astana International Financial Center. So if you're serious and if you have a couple of bucks in your pocket, instead of going to a Kazakh court, you choose arbitration or litigation in the Astana International Financial Center under the English law with the English jurists, with the English lawyers. And that would be more credible and enforceable inside Kazakhstan. So for business law, this is quite good.
And that system works.
Yeah, it started working. It's pretty young, but it started working.
Okay, interesting. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please keep your eye on our website for more Central Asia events. Thank you and good evening.